552 is the unique ID of this user story. So it's user story ST-552 or 552, whatever you want to call it. All right. And then here, for example, below Mike's picture, you can see it says 1 hour and 30 minutes. So that's basically his estimate for doing this particular user story. That's what he estimated it would take him. Okay. And that's why you see this one that says 2.3, 2 hours and a half. It basically means he estimated for this subtask that it would take him 2.3 hours. Some of the user stories don't have time, or some of the subtasks or user stories don't have time because he might not have had a chance to actually estimate them, and he just started working on them, or he finished them before he even had a chance to estimate them. And obviously, this is also something that is very typical. And this is, I wanted to show you this example because it's such a great example. It's real world, what happens in the real world and real world applications. Ideally, in Agile, if you went by the theory, you would have estimated the time it would take you to execute all the different user stories. And generally, in Agile or in Scrum, we don't normally and typically estimate in time, in hours, but most of the time we estimate in story points. In our case, in our project in particular, we're actually not using story points, but as a team, we decided that we wanted to estimate in hours. Okay, just because it makes it easier for us to manage the time, the workload, and the resource allocation. But you don't have to. You can actually do your estimation in story points if that is easier for you and for your team. Like I said, this is just an example. Okay, so I just wanted to show you here also that in the real world, a lot of times people don't actually estimate the time or don't actually assign the story points or the time it will take them to complete a user story before they actually get started with the work. Ideally, they would. That is part of what we call sprint planning. But in the real world, sometimes we're busy. Sometimes we have a ton of things going on. In this example, Mike he's not only working on this project, he actually works in the operation as well. So I'm sure he didn't get a chance to actually add his estimation to all of these other user stories. And as you can see, he actually had a bunch of them as well to work on and a bunch of subtasks as well. So he added the time where he could. Okay. This other little color here that you're seeing is basically what it's representing is that this user story is part of an epic that we called ONI MVP for Research Office. So ONI is basically one of the things that we're working on in this project, and it's one of our big deliverables and our epics, as we call them in Agile or in Scrum. And in particular, I guess I'm not going to go into all the details of what it means, but in essence, it's basically like a portal, like a data portal that we built for the research office that allows them to see successful grants in that website and in that portal. Okay, so that's one of the things that Mike has been working on in this sprint. And if I scroll down more and more and more to see Moises was also helping out with this epic, and that's why he has that user story that is part of ONI as well, MVP for Research Office. And in case you don't remember, MVP stands for Minimum Viable Product, which is one of the Agile concepts we use. And then if you look at the things that he finished, there is also another epic that he was working on, which is operating system patching, right? So Stash, Mero, GitLab. So 3 things that he was patching as part of the sprint. Now, obviously, if you wanted to open any of these user stories to see what we did specifically, you can just click on them or you can just right click and then open link in new tab, and it'll take you specifically to the user story. And we can see here the user story that is a type, it's a user story, status, it's done, it's priority minor, components, it didn't have any component assigned, no labels, but you can change. Again, you can change all of this in Jira. Remember, you can edit it, you can comment. It's very flexible. What you're seeing is basically what we have assigned. So in this case, it's a sprint 2, sprint 3, because it's something that we were carrying over from the previous sprint. So Mike started to work on the indexer full text search, but he actually wasn't able to complete it in sprint 2, and that's why it carried over for sprint 3. That's why we actually carried it over for this sprint. And these are the tasks that he completed that were part of this user story, as you can see. And then here on the right hand side, you can see what he estimated, the remaining amount of time, and how much time he actually logged onto this specific user story that he was working on. Okay. And you can see here below the activity of the user story. So comments, if we went to all, it basically show you when it was created, changes, like all the history that this user story has, and all the history that it went through. And that's also something that I really like about Jira, which is pretty cool, which is it basically keeps a log of any changes you make to a user story. And the activity here, you can see all, or you can just specifically look at comments if there are any, work log, history, activity. And I'm just going to quickly, there were no comments in this user story, work log. So people here, Naomi works on, spent some time on this. She's another team member. And Mike, he spent 2 hours. So this is the work that they logged in this user story. History shows a bit of the history. So what was the original value and what was the new value of the user story? And if we went to activity, it'll just show you the whole activity, with the date, kind of like I guess it's showing you a chronology, like a timeline, a time frame of when things happen in that activity. And here on the right, it's a bunch more of information like people, dates, time tracking, development, agile, the sprints, view on board, and chats. Okay. So I'm just going to go back. I'm just going to close this and I'm just going to go back here. Like I said, you can open any user story by just simply right clicking and then open link in new tab. You can also click it. If you just click it if you just click it with the left hands, with the left button on your mouse, it's just going to open it here on the right hand side, kind of like I can minimize the view of it, right? But if you can also close that, or like I said before, you can right click and open this and it'll just show you all the details in case you wanted to go into the details of that user story. Same goes for any of them. Okay. So this is a really good example. And if you can see here, quick filters, it basically shows you different filters that we've added here at the top. But like I said before, all of this is stuff that you can configure. If you go to the configure, you can hide details if you wanted to. You can expand, you can collapse, hide epic labels. So if I did, let's just click here just to show you. So remember that this thing here only is an epic. If I clicked on it, you would hide them. So you wouldn't see the epics, you would just see the user stories. But if we wanted to see it again, we just click here, show epic labels, and it'll show us the epics for each of the user stories. Remember that a subtask is part of a user story, which is why you're not seeing an epic assigned to it, is because this is the user story, and this is kind of like if you were thinking of a tree, this is like a branch of this bigger tree. And that's why it's a subtask of this user story, and that's why the epic is at the higher level, which is the user story. Okay, so in this part of the course, we've covered a real-world example of what a Scrum board, an Agile board, or a Jira board, if you want to call it that, looks like. And like I said, we had in this the 3 typical columns that you would see, which is the to-do, in progress, and done. But you could, like I said before, you could actually change this if you wanted to. Okay, if you click this, you can actually hide the header as well. If you wanted to expand this view, let me just show you real quickly. If I click this, it's just gonna hide that menu at the top and make this bigger, which might be good if you're actually in a presentation and showing this to someone. And again, you can actually minimize this again if you just click this. And this is a really good example of an Agile board here in Jira. And we've covered basically what we were working on in Sprint 3. So this shows you at a glance everything that we did in Sprint 3. And in this case, and in this particular project, by the way, we're just adding the user stories that developers are working on. We're not adding in our board the work that everyone else in the team is doing, but specifically we're focusing on the development side of things. So these are all the things that these 2 guys have been working on in this sprint, which is pretty much completing and finishing today, because as you can see here, it has 0 days remaining. But like I said before, in this project, we're doing fortnightly sprints. If there were, for example, 3 days left, then here you would see 3 days left. But because today is kind of like the last day, it's actually saying 0 days remaining, meaning that we're actually finishing and wrapping up the sprint. one of the things in Jira is that even though we might have actually completed the sprint, it doesn't automatically complete for you. You actually manually complete it, mark it complete. And that's just pretty good also, like I said, in terms of flexibility in Jira. It just gives the power on the Scrum Master or to the team itself to actually decide when they actually mark that complete. Okay? And that's just something that, you can manage on. Ideally, you're going to close it on the day. Of course, like in this case, we should be closing it today, but it is up to you if you wanted to close it on a different date. It really gives you that flexibility to manage that. All right, guys, I hope you've enjoyed this real world example. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. This is what a Agile board looks like in Jira, or a Scrum board looks like in Jira. And this is one of the things that we're referring to as a team all the time in our stand-ups, when we're looking at our progress. And when you're working on things yourself, this is one of the things you're actually going back to and just seeing where you're at with things, what you're going to work on next. Because remember that even though we might have a backlog, and we'll look at the backlog in another part of the course, even though we might have a backlog with another additional bunch of things that we're working on, we're obviously in this scenario, we're just going to show in the sprint the things that we're working on in this particular sprint, in this particular fortnight. So you're not going to see, because it can become quite distracting when you have a project and it's a big project and you have a bunch of, hundreds or over thousands of tasks that you need to complete to finish a project. Actually, this is one of the powerful things about Agile. It gives you the power to focus on a short time frame on the very specific things that you're going to be doing and the very specific things that you're going to be delivering in that sprint, which is what you're seeing here on screen. So Mike delivered a bunch of stuff in this sprint, so I'm sure everyone's going to be really happy. As you can see, he actually completed a lot of things that he was working on in this sprint. And Moise is the same. He also completed 6 user stories. And you can see here, by the way, just as a little note next to the name, the number of user stories. You're seeing here that it has the word issues. Again, don't worry too much about that. That's just a convention and the conventional name that Jira uses for users. When they create something in the system, they're generally referring to it as an issue initially, but it doesn't mean that it's a problem. It actually just means it can be a user story. It can be it can be a user story. It can be a subtask. It can be pretty much anything that as you name it or as you categorize it. Again, like I said, don't worry too much about that. You'll get the hang of it as you're working with it. It's just a convention and this goes back, and that's why I wanted to talk to you before when I talked about the history of Jira. Like I said, Jira initially was born to track issues, to track bugs in software, but it's evolved and it's nowadays used for agile project management. But some of the things are legacy, and they're still, some of the names that you see in the system, in Jira as a system, are still legacy. So they still use a lot the word issues, but not always they're actually referring to an issue per se, if that makes sense. I'm sure you're gonna get the hang of it as you're working with it. And like I said, don't worry too much about that. Just to real quickly to elaborate on that and not to make sure you're not confused by it. If you actually open this user story ST552, I'm just going to right click, open link in new tab just to go into the details of that user story. Do you see here that there's a type? And do you remember how I explained this little icon represents that it's a user story or a story? If I actually clicked here on edit and I clicked on the drop down here, I could actually change this to a task, a bug, or an epic. So like I said before, that's why I was saying to you, don't worry too much about these names. Jira is very flexible and you can change them and you can rename it if you wanted to. So in Jira's terms, when they're talking about issues, they're referring to any of these three things. It could be, or any of these four things. It could be a story, a task, a bug, or an epic. It's just how the system was built. So don't get confused by that. Like I said, it's just how when they built Jira initially, they just called it issues. And that's why every time you create something, when you click here on create, it just basically creates a new issue. As you can see here, they call it issue, but it's not really an issue. As you can see in the drop down below, you can actually convert that into a story, a bug, an epic, or a task, right? Not necessarily an issue per se. issue is just a name they gave it in the system. I'm pretty sure at some point in the future, Atlassian might decide to rename that from issue to something else, create whatever. But for now, they just kept the legacy, how they've always called it in the system, which is issue, because that's how the system was when it was born. They were always referring to things as issues when they were creating something in the system. And that's just, I guess, the legacy and the history of Jira as a product, because it originally started as a bug tracking and an issue tracking application. But nowadays, it's used for things way beyond that. And like I said before, even though you're seeing here tasks, story, bugs, and epics, Jira actually allows you to configure this stuff and change it. So you can actually go here to configure, and you could actually change this in the, configuration settings of Jira if you wanted to change this. But most of the time, it'll be fine. Most of the time, I don't think you'll actually need to create anything or configure this differently. The default things that Jira gives you are pretty good and pretty standard, and what most agile teams and project teams use. So just go with the flow, just use what's there. But like I said, if you wanted to, there are ways for you to change this. And I'm going to, as part of this course, I'm going to include a lot of documentation and just the links to the knowledge bases like we saw before, and the Jira community. So if you ever had a question or you're trying to do something and you're unsure about how to do it, you can just refer to their videos or just Google, what you're trying to achieve, and a bunch of, articles or knowledge base articles or videos might come up on how to do it. Okay. I'm just going to cancel this, but I just wanted to show you what I was referring to about this, how Jira uses the name issue to refer to task, user story, bugs, or epics, or whatever you've named that. It's just an example, like I said before. I'm just going to close it. So here in this case, because we have here user stories and subtasks, etc., when we say 30 issues, we're actually referring to 30 user stories and subtasks, and pretty much just 30 things that Mike is working on, regardless of what they are, all right? So that's the same for when we were below here looking at Moises, and he had the 12 things. So I'm just going to very quickly count them for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There you go. These are the 12 issues, as Jira would call them. But in reality, as you saw, there are actually user stories, subtasks, and in this case, bug. We have 2 bugs in this sprint that Moises was working on. So the collection of these 12 different things in Jira is what Jira would refer to as issues, right? Or what we would call, in layman terms, 12 things that Moises is working on, right? And in the Scrum board, in this Agile board, in this Jira board, you can see by the icon what each of them are, what each of those 12 issues are, whether it's a story, a user story, a subtask, or a bug, as they were classified by the person who created the user story or the task or the bug in the first instance. When they created this, remember when you click on create, it gives you the option here on the issue type to set what you want to set. So you can set it as a user story if it's a user story. You can set it as a bug if it's a bug. You can set it as an epic if it's an epic, right? So remember, all of that is very flexible and all of that is under your control, which is why Jira is so powerful. And like I said before, don't forget that you can actually change this and add more things to this if you wanted to. But I'm pretty sure you're not going to need more than what's already there. All right, guys, I hope you've enjoyed this part of the course in which we covered what a Scrum board looks like in Jira and how you use it. And don't forget that you can just drag and drop things if you wanted to between the columns. So just real quickly, all of these things are things you can actually drag and drop. And alternatively, you can actually go into them and make changes directly by opening them or just clicking here. And then this will come up on the left-hand side. And there's a little other things here, like you can add attachments to each user story or to each subtask or to each whatever it is that you're doing. You can add comments, you can add attachments, you can add subtasks like we saw before. You can capture like a screenshot. So each of these issues in Jira, whether it's a user story, a subtask, a bug, an epic, whatever it is, allows you to add a ton of information, which we saw when we clicked on the create button. And I'll, in another part of the course, I'll go into a lot more detail into one of these create, what this create thing looks like, even though I've covered it a bit before, but we'll go a little bit more slowly, so you can have a think and have a look at it. But this is what I wanted to show you in this part of the course. I'm sure you'll get a lot of value. And like I said before, this is a real world sprint and a real world user story subtask bugs that we're working on for this project. All right, guys, I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.